Hi everyone, and welcome to this session, the Q&A for the Uprising documentary with Pravini here. So I'm Tyler Ebanja, and I am a third-year architectural and interdisciplinary studies student at the Bartlett. And yeah, welcome. And I'll pass over to my colleague, Renee.
Yeah. So hi, my name is Renee Etokakpan, and I study project management for construction at the Bartlett CPM. I am also a third-year student. And I definitely look forward to having this very important conversation, about the documentary that Pravini directed.
And then our woman of the hour, Pravini here.
Thank you so much, Renee and Tyler, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Pravini Baburam. I'm an artist and activist. I focus on decolonial theory and practice and try to use art as a means for social change. And I look forward to your questions and the conversation. Thank you.
Perfect. And I would just like to say to our audience, please at any time, write your questions and things just in the chat, and so we can start this dialogue. That's what it is, a dialogue, a Q&A. So please, questions in the chat. So really, we're just going to start with sort of our summary and reflections on the documentary itself. I have to say that for me, I loved it. It was such a breath of fresh air to sort of know that there are many, many organizations around the world in Western Europe that all sort of have the same not issues, but sort of the same goal in mind of decolonializing, Western Europe. And I think this is very important, especially, at the Bartlett and at these institutions. But it was just sort of so nice and so exciting and inspiring to sort of see that happening. Yeah. Renee, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the themes that were tackled in the documentary, the fact that there has always been resistance.
Renee, is she frozen?
Yes, I believe she is.
Yeah, she's frozen a bit. Oh, okay. Well, that's what happens when you're over Zoom, I guess. This new COVID type thing. Renee, you're frozen. But yeah, no, we can just continue on with the. We'll just continue on. I mean, I think that the documentary was amazing. The use of music as well to sort of, illustrate your points, and it was just a great thing to sort of see, and it really did inspire me. I mean, where was your inspiration in, deciding what was, where did this sort of come from?
Well, there were actually different factors. So first, I think it's good to mention that the music actually came first. So I was, before making this documentary, I was already an independent artist making music for quite some time. And I was writing a new album, but I was also very much involved in the anti-racism movement, in, attending the Palestine solidarity protests and the anti-Blackface protests. And I realized that those experiences came back in the music. When I was writing about those experiences, about those emotions, but also the analysis that comes along with, decolonization. So that was one that when I was writing the music, I saw images. It wasn't just music, but I saw the images that you now see in the film. And I realized that it was actually a bigger story. It wasn't just, 9 songs that were separate, but they were actually connected, and they were telling, a story with a historical perspective, with, present day experience, and also with the future, imagining the future. And I also wanted to take it to another level by, interviewing these academics and activists, because I encounter all these people in the movement, and especially when it comes to analysis, the professors but also the activists who speak at events. The events are usually, with they're not mass rallies, they're small gatherings. And so I felt like, more people need to know about this, but maybe it's in a language that is too academic, or too abstract for people who need, simple words, but who understand the problem. Just the way that is presented is maybe a bit too complex. So I wanted to make that theory accessible through film, through music, and present it in a way that it was understandable for everyone who's already involved in the movement. I had a very specific idea to not convince people of a problem, but to analyze the problem. That was my starting point. And that was actually also another factor why I wanted to make this film, because I'm an artist and activist besides my work. So this isn't something I do full time. This is what I do in my free time. And for my day job, I work at an NGO that focuses on diversity and inclusion in higher education. So I work with a lot of educational professionals, and that's how, I also encountered Bartlett, where we talk about diversity and inclusion, but we don't always talk about decolonization. And I experienced the limits of diversity and inclusion sometimes when people don't connect it to colonial history. And when we do, there's a lot of discomfort, and you need to put people at ease. And I didn't want to put people at ease. I wanted to be unapologetic. This is the way that a lot of people experience the world. And it's a world that feels like it's upside down, for us, for especially people who have been colonized, for descendants of colonized peoples. So for me, that was the starting point to present a story that I was looking for, as I also mentioned in the beginning of the film, and have it presented in such a way that is emotional through the music, but also analytical through the interviews, and in the end, a call to action, to say, this is what is going on, this is what is happening. There are a lot of organizations and networks out there fighting for us, fighting for our liberation, and join the movement, because there's a lot to be hopeful about, despite, the overwhelming system that we face. But there's also a lot to be hopeful for. And let's continue the work that has been done for 400 years.
Yeah, I think that the message about hope definitely was like very important. It's one of the things that I was like, oh, I'm gonna latch onto that, because I think one of the people said it's been a fight that's been going on for like 500 years. It's been 400 years of enslavement and colonization. So even if we have to wait another 400 to 500 years to fight, then we should be prepared to do that. And I think that was such a powerful message to end the documentary on.
Yeah, that was actually also one of my biggest learnings when making this film, because I also, learned from every conversation. And indeed, one of the things that really that I carry with me ever since is this long view of history, where you realize, oh yeah, this is a 500-year-old system. So we can't expect to dismantle the system, in our 20 years or even our lifetime. And to understand the importance of an intergenerational approach, and to understand that we're a small part of a bigger movement, a movement that has been here for hundreds of years, and that will be here for another, few hundred years. And to know that you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, that you're not alone, and to then figure out what can you do and where can you play a role. That has been one of the biggest learnings for me, and also what keeps me driven, you know, because you can get tired of the struggle. But when you look at it from that point of view, it's like, oh yeah, I can carry on.
I mean, for sure, I know that that's definitely been something, you know, in you know, my life recently, especially within the school, when having to call things out when, you know, it's not, this isn't correct, whatever. And there has been, you know, there has been times where I'd come home and cry to my dad and be like, oh, this is so, you know, I feel like I'm the only one, you know, and all of that kind of thing. So seeing that in the documentary and knowing that, you know, you're not alone, you're knowing, you know, that there's a whole load of people, both dead and alive, that is cheering you on. You know, I think that was really, really such a great way to end it, and to know that, you know, we've got to keep going. And, you know, we've already done the big bits, but we still, you know, we've still got a long way to go, you know?
Yeah, indeed. It's, you know, like you mentioned, to also understand the relative privileges that we have, you know. I mean, when you look at our ancestors who have died in the struggle, I realize, you know, the difficult conversations that we have are a small price to pay when you look at the prices, the price that our ancestors paid. So to also understand, you know, our privilege in that sense, specifically speaking from the global north, you know, even though we have our own struggles, you know, in the land of the colonizer. But at the same time, we also have privilege that comes with it that we can use in the struggle. So yeah, I definitely recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Yeah.
you know, it's a whole.
Yeah, I think we just got a question from Sarah who says, can you give some examples of where activists you talk to have been successful in fighting injustice and what works? I think one of the most important examples of that from the documentary was the Indonesian man who like launched who is suing the Dutch state for their.
It's pretty badass, right?
Yeah, that was amazing.
Yeah.
When I saw that, I went off, I was like, this is like such a big brain moment. Like, of course, like they need to be held accountable for like all the things that they did, you know. And also the bit about like, you know, we like Indonesia had to pay reparations to like the Dutch government, but then when it comes for the Dutch government to like pay reparations back for all the harm that they caused, it suddenly becomes a problem, and it's like, but the logic doesn't follow.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think actually, you know, a lot of the campaigns that were highlighted in the film have been really successful. You know, the lawsuits, I mean, he won the lawsuits. So the Dutch state had to acknowledge and had to pay. And then you can have a discussion on the amount, you know, of the reparations. But the fact remains that there's now, you know, at least from a legal point of view, acknowledgement that what the Dutch did was wrong. And also, you know, the party Denk, you know, who is in parliament, you know, to have a political party founded by people of color gaining seats in, you know, the center of power, that's a major accomplishment that hasn't been achieved elsewhere in Europe. The anti-Blackface movement, you know, 10 years ago, when you would criticize Zwarte Piet, blackface, people would say you are the crazy one. And now, you know, it's actually considered wrong to continue blackface. So I think that shows the impact of these campaigns, and also um, the way that the struggle really pays off, you know. And I think the anti-blackface movement shows that, you know, it takes 10 years. And for us, this seems like a very long time because we want change yesterday and not, you know, in 10 years. But again, when you look at it from, you know, the long view of history, where we think about hundreds of years, then 10 years is actually really fast. You know, and I didn't think that I would see the day where, you know, my child would attend a school without blackface. I didn't think that was possible 10 years ago, but, you know, here we are. So it just shows that, you know, the struggle pays off, but it comes with a price. It comes with sacrifice. And I think that is why we have these conversations to reflect on that and to empower each other to keep going.
For sure. Well, I mean, we have another question from Nicole as well. So she says, decolonizing is a process and the final outcome, which she's, you know, nobody sure about. But what are some of the key markers to know that decolonization is happening?
Yeah, great question, by the way. I think, you know, decolonization means different things in different contexts. Speaking, you know, from the Dutch context, what I can say, for instance, if you look at Black Lives Matter, one of the outcomes or key markers of decolonization is how certain conversations that have been marginalized and took place in the margins have now shifted towards the center. You know, I think if you look at Black Lives Matter, you know, again, 10 years ago, it was considered radical to say Black Lives Matter. And now it's considered normal. You have big corporate organizations putting out statements that support Black Lives Matter. You have mass protests with not just Black people, but white people, you know, standing up and say Black Lives Matter. So now that it becomes part of center stage, I think that's a key marker that it's a normalized mainstream debate that is no longer taking place in the margins. So whatever is part of the mainstream debate, I would say is a marker for decolonization. And I think we also need to look at, you know, what are some of the colonial mechanisms or colonial frameworks, for instance, education. What is happening in education? You know, decolonizing the curriculum is a good example. So all the mechanisms that have been used to colonize, not just the country, but the minds, and all the counters that are now put forth to decolonize, I would consider as a marker to see where we're at. And I would even say that this conversation is already part of this decolonization process.
I think what was interesting is, I think earlier in the week, I saw a comment on YouTube that was claiming that, you know, all of the grassroots movement, you know, like the anti-racist movements, LGBT rights, you know, civil rights movements were all instituted by like the big government or like big data. And I feel like once these movements have become normalized enough that conspiracy theorists think that it's coming from like the top down, I think like that's a huge marker that we're actually doing something right.
Yeah, and you know, actually, that's a good point, because I was recently flagged by this far right Twitter account. So once you're flagged, you're doing something right.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that means that the establishment considers you as a threat, you know? So yeah, I think that's also a marker for sure.
I also think a marker is definitely, you know, self-healing, self-reflection,
Yes.
self-education as well. Not just from people of color, but also from white people as well. You know, having that internal conversation and being able to then project it out to, you know, your friends of color or to other people as well. That is a big marker, because then, you know, we're also normalizing it, but also being able to then take it up further and, you know, push
Yeah,
the boundaries a lot further as well.
I think that's actually a great example, you know, the actions of solidarity, and you know, also the relationship between white people and people of color, where there's always, you know, this question of power, where you know, a white person has a different position of power than a person of color. But and that is the case in you know, in these institutionalized dynamics, you know. So when it comes to applying for a job, you know, then yeah, a white person has a different position of power than a person of color. But when it comes to the individual relationships and interactions, sometimes, you know, we project those positions of power into a relationship. And then, you know, for instance, you get this dynamics where when we talk about racism, some people feel white people aren't allowed to speak. When, when it's an individual conversation, you want to hear an opinion of another person, and I think that is sometimes the balance that people are searching for. When are you talking to someone as a human being?
Yeah.
Are you talking to someone who's in a position of power and you need to challenge the power? And I think, that is also part of decolonization, to understand when you're talking to power and when are you talking to people, and how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely like an important distinction to make, because especially if you view every individual person as like a representation of that power structure, then it's also like a lot of stress on yourself, because you feel like every time you have to talk to like, a white person, or maybe someone who's like illusioned by the state, it's just a lot of effort on your part, because you feel like you have to attack and like, destructure those notions. But, sometimes you can just take a break and have a conversation.
Yeah. And also the other way around, when you have people of color in front of you, it doesn't mean that they always are on your side.
Yeah.
I just like the film was this, discussing how divide and rule works. Sometimes people of color are put in a position of power to confirm, the colonized ideas, or the colonial ideas. So I think that also shows how important it is to really focus on content and, the actual arguments that are being discussed, rather than the identities that represent those arguments. And identity is very important, obviously, representation is very important. So I'm not saying that isn't an important factor, but we need to remain critical of, the content that is related to identities that are part of the conversation.
Okay. We have a question from Rachna here. It says, the movie had a powerful message about the symbols of colonization, predominantly Christianity. I would appreciate your reflection on how do we decolonize when ourselves wearing the symbols of colonialism, whether that be in religion, in dress, eating and living habits, etc. Do we need to commiserate that there are some things that we may never revive, such as community ways of living and historical practices or festivals? Yeah.
Yes, I think that indeed is a difficult question. I remember I did a screening in a church in the UK, and I was quite nervous about it because it was the first time I was in, a religious type of setting, where people who identify, as Christian, and then, watch the film, and white people who identify as Christian also. But then I think it was the pastor, shared some reflections afterwards and mentioned, I think it's important to acknowledge the role that the church played in colonial history, and to see how we can come to terms with that. So I think in that sense, the Christianity has been also instrumentalized, in colonialism. So I think the message is of solidarity can remain, but the way that it has been used to oppress people, you need to be critical of, and there needs to be some type of acknowledgement and reparation. So I think the way that these symbols have been used, we need to be critical of, and we need to find ways to come to terms with that. But also look at the way that religion can help people deal with things. So it's again a layered conversation. I think it's not one dimensional. So looking at the different dimensions of these symbols and see what we can learn from that, I would say is my approach.
Yeah, I think it's similar to what you said earlier about like, the individual versus the system.
Yeah, exactly.
So Christianity and a lot of religions are co-opted by someone's purpose and like used as a tool of oppression, but it's different on like the individual basis. So it's just recognizing that difference.
Yeah, I mean, the same goes, if I may offer a personal reflection, I identify as Hindu, and I live, as a minority in the Netherlands. But when I go to India, I will be part of the majority in a position of power. you know, and I don't agree with the way that Hinduism is now being used also, you know, for the nation state in India.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you know, there's a reproduction of power taking place. But it doesn't mean that the Hindu philosophy is something that I disagree with. You know, it's I have my own way of interpreting that and applying that. So I think that the same goes for Christianity.
Yeah.
We have another question. What are some examples of movements resisting co-optation or the illusion of progress?
Sorry, let me also co-optation. Well, okay. I think the question of co-optation is really interesting, right? Because the question is, for instance, would you say Black Lives Matter is being co-opted because it's part of mainstream? If there are major companies supporting Black Lives Matter, is that co-optation or is that progress? Because I think the question we need to ask, what do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve big corporates acknowledging that Black Lives Matter, right? So when they put out a statement, what does that say? Now, obviously, you can offer your critical reflections and say, well, it's window dressing, right? That would be the illusion of progress. But, you know, I've also encountered organizations from the work that I do, because I don't just work with higher education, I also work with the corporate industry, where there are sincere people who are having conversations on Black Lives Matter, on institutional racism in their organizations, and people of color are addressing those questions and they gain support from white allies. So is that then co-optation or is that actual progress, you know? So I think for the movement, we also need to identify what we want to achieve. Like literally, you know, if we want corporates to put out statements to support Black Lives Matter, then I would say that's progress. And then think about the next step. Okay, great, you have a statement, great. But what's the next step? Okay, so now maybe quota, or, you know, maybe celebrating Black History Month too, you know? So in that sense, co-optation can also feel, I think for some organizations, as if whatever they do is considered, you know, is met with suspicion. And I think we need to have honest conversations about, well, what do we expect from you and what type of markers can we identify? And, you know, an explicit statement is already the first one. And even if you don't mean it, it's still a sign of progress because it shows that it's no longer acceptable not to support. You know, so even if it doesn't say anything about the corporates, it does say something about the way the conversation is shifting from considering Black Lives Matter as radical to how it's actually the right thing to do. So in that sense, I would, you know, that is how I look at progress. Yeah.
I think, you know, the only example I can think of on the top of my head would be, you know, in terms of Black Lives Matter and the Breonna Taylor case, in which, you know, so many, you know, there's protests and things, and then the state, you know, introduced Breonna's law and justice for Breonna Taylor and stuff, but yet there's been no arresting of the police officer.
Yeah.
Things
So,
like that.
yeah.
So then more protests and more, you know, and it's sort of something like that, I guess.
Yeah. No, I definitely, I agree. And I think in that sense, what we need to then demand in terms of the movement is accountability, right?
Yeah.
So you can have Breonna's, what's it called? The legislation or law.
Breonna's law, yeah.
But then if something happens, you need to, how do you say that? You need to make sure that the law is being, you know, applied. Yeah, exactly. And if that doesn't happen, then it's up to us to demand it, you know, and to put that in the center of the conversation. So indeed, that's why I say, you know, we need to remain critical. But the fact that, you know, there is a shift happening from not even knowing what her name was before to a conversation that is happening that is now center stage. which actually forces, the establishment to respond, that is to me already a sign of maybe not so much progress, but impact. Maybe we can also distinguish that. Yeah. So like I mean, it's also for me a thought process. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we have another question here from Rudy that says, are there examples of any colonial institutions willingly decolonizing? And do we decolonize by like appealing to the colonial institutions? Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is the eternal question in terms of, do you demand change within the institutions or outside, right? So dismantling the master's house with the master's tools conversation. I do think, there's you can only decolonize what has been colonial. You know what I mean? So in that sense, but I'm not sure if we have to appeal to these institutions or we have to demand. I think there's a difference there, where appealing is almost like you're asking, and demanding is, demanding, and understanding that it's, a confrontation that you're having rather than maybe a nice conversation. So it really is a matter of strategy on how do you decolonize or try to bring about change. And I do think that there's a lot happening, at least within higher education, specifically research universities in the Netherlands, that have been talking about decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing universities, and have been, screening the film to kind of think about that, because that's how I know it's happening. I was actually surprised by the amount of requests I got from universities to show the film, because I thought it was more like a grassroots communities that would be drawn to the film. But actually, a lot is happening in education, and education is one of the most important tools of colonization. So in that sense, yeah, I do think it's important to decolonize the institutions from within, but it's good to have the outside pressure, because the outside pressure is not depending on the power dynamics within the institution. So and I think that needs to work together, where people within the institution can say, well, I wouldn't go out on the streets to protest, but I do agree with the message, and we need to take that seriously in the institution. So to understand how you can navigate, from a radical voice to a more diplomatic voice, and how that works in the power structures, and how you can use that to your advantage.
Yeah, I think that the point about education also ties into a question that Bethania asks. They say, coming from the global South and living for a while in London, it was kind of tricky for me to navigate, and also like to navigate academia and to like raise discussions about race and colonization. They said they felt that somehow the notion of ethnicity was brought sometimes to tackle the issue, but without actually confronting the racial issues behind it. They felt it was harder to fight against racism without really talking about the different identities based in race. And they want to know if you could talk about it regarding the story of resistance in Europe.
Yes, thank you, Betania, for that reflection and question. I think this is actually one of the most important challenges that we faced, and within the work that I do, we call this, the color blindness. So no one wants to talk about race, no one wants to talk about color, because we don't see color, right? and that is, what I also addressed in La La Land, where race doesn't play a role because people don't acknowledge it. And I think one of the biggest shifts that has been taking place the past few years is from a colorblind approach to a color brave approach, where we say, no, we need to talk about race. Because if you don't see color, you don't see me, you don't see the challenges that come along with it, you don't see the realities that we face, but you also don't see the richness that we bring to the table, and the things that we're proud of, things that empower us. One of the biggest challenges that we have faced in both diversity and inclusion work and decolonization has been to talk about race and to be willing to have the uncomfortable conversations and to have strategies to make those conversations constructive and productive, towards change. So I completely recognize that experience, and that is actually one of the most important parts of the work, is to force people to have that conversation, but in a way, again, that is constructive.
Yeah, I think I definitely like relate to the question because I'm Nigerian Cameroonian and I grew up there. I went to school in like Nigeria and Togo. So, it was in a sense like I was going to international school. So I was being taught, the colonial, the mind slavery sort of thing was trying to be applied to me. But because our teachers were teaching to a class of, mostly like African students, coming from across the continent, we could recognize like, oh no, some of these things that you're telling us are lies, But then you go to the UK to study and it's sort of like, those same lies are being perpetrated, but you don't have enough of there are not as many people around you to recognize and say, no, that's not my history, that's my country. So you don't have that backup. But I think one of the important things about like decolonizing the curriculum and like, race and space coming into being is that it now sort of like gives us that basis. Like the Bartlett is recognizing, hey, you need to like identify these ideas, you need to like bring it into your curriculum. There should be like a space for that reflection. So like now I'm definitely ready to like go into every class and being like, hey, so where's your addition to the race and space? Like, how have you talked about like, the different ethnicities and like everything like that? Like, where is that reflected in like your lecture? So yeah, I think that's one of the things that I'm going to take with me in the coming weeks.
Yeah, I also think within practice and the profession, and just especially in the UK, we sort of have this umbrella term called Black and Ethnic Minority Group.
Yeah, BAME, right?
Yeah, the BAME.
Yeah.
And it irks me so much because you be in these staff meetings and they'll be like, we've got this much BAME in our company or whatever, but then when you break it down, you've got one Black person, 3 Indian, all of those, and then you break it down again, you've got 50 white people and these tiny proportion, and it's just, I think definitely that, especially within practice as well, and within sort of the working world, as university students, we're going to be going into that world very soon. There does need to be this racial discussion of, we don't have many Black people, or we don't have many people from East Asia, all of these things that then feed into a sort of not just a diversity through color, but also a diversity through thought and approach, thinking and things like that.
But I will tell you something. Well, I wanted to say funny, but actually it's not that funny, but we have to laugh about it, otherwise it's really sad. But anyway, you mentioned BAME, right? So and this is from the UK context. So this is my reflection from the Dutch context, where we actually would be really happy with a concept like BAME, because then we would actually talk about Black and and ethnic minorities. I think is Dutch.
Yeah.
Because if you hear the terms that we have used here for years to this day, you're gonna laugh. So one is allochtoon. It's a Dutch word, but it basically means that one or both of your parents have been born abroad. So to stress the fact that you're not Dutch. But then you have Western and non-Western allochtoon, which basically says, white or non-white, but it doesn't say white. It says autochthon. So they have terminology to talk about race without talking about race. Then you have the terminology bicultural, which basically means that you have, both a white and non-white parent. But bicultural literally means you can have a mother from France and a father from Germany as still be white. So, but whenever people use that term, they understand it's about people of color. You also have the term people with a migrant background. So policy-wise, I would be considered as a person with a migrant background or a non-Western migrant background. But I was born in the Netherlands. I didn't migrate. So just again to show the language that has been used, the terminology, to not talk about race when we all know we're talking about race. This is kind of the schizophrenia that is happening in the Netherlands, you know, where people, and, you know, also even in the work that I do within education, I was kind of forced to use these terms to make people comfortable, you know, because when we talk about race or people of color, they're like, but, you know, what do you mean? So this is, unfortunately, now with Black Lives Matter and the conversation about Zwarte Piet, people understand it's necessary to talk about race. But just to give you, these are policy terms. So, you know, there are actual, you know, for instance, job vacancies that use, you know, this type of terminology to speak to diversity and inclusion without talking about race. So I just wanted to share that and say how that it's an illustration of how difficult it was in the Netherlands.
Thank you. We have another question here as well. They said, I think people should be free to show or not to show their symbols, and the rest of the people should respect the identity of everyone. Don't you think so?
Of course, you know, people should be free to show whatever they want. I also think people should be free to respond to the symbols if they feel it's offensive. You know, so in that sense, if we ask everyone, you know, or acknowledge the freedom of everyone, it also has to be the freedom of everyone. And I think this is, you know, what the film is actually putting up for discussion. It's not the case. You know, when you have freedom of expression, you should be able to critique Zwarte Piet. So why are people being arrested for it? You know, and I think this is the question of, you know, freedom for whom. So I agree with the freedom. And I think it should be applied to everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. We got a question here from Nicole that says, research and program evaluation have colonial origins. So what recommendations do you have for researchers to engage in research using decolonizing theory in practice? I think that reflects back to, you know, like the social science perspective that is trying to still perpetuate the division of the, you know, the global south versus the global north, you know, more economically advanced versus less economically advanced and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I think the colonial origin is related not so much or not just to research and program evaluation, but to actual knowledge production, you know? So, and then the research and program evaluation is a consequence of that knowledge production. So decolonizing knowledge production means that you have a critical view on the way that knowledge has been constructed and produced, you know. And I think one of the examples is, for instance, I know Ramon Grosvogel, who was also part of the film, often talks about how Western science has separated the human from nature, where, you know, the human can study nature or can even exploit nature without thinking that it will affect the human. So I think, you know, the way that we think about the relationship between human and nature is a form of knowledge production. So to decolonize that means that we have to be critical of the concepts that have been produced by Western or Westernized universities. And then indeed you get to the way you evaluate it and research it as well. So I think I wanted to go back to the question, but I hope that answers the question. I don't know if I missed something in my answer, but yeah, please let me know.
I know, well, I know just from me, like when I'm bored, I watch a load of like videos about, you know, like, you know, the medical industry and sort of slavery's involvement in that, and sort of using, you know, Black women for midwifery and stuff. And so all of that data from, you know, things like that, which I definitely think isn't really spoke about a lot, and how, you know, the data that is used for a lot of industries. The historical data that is then perpetuated now in contemporary, in our contemporary modern times, has been used by, has been very much rooted in the colonial aspect, and it's very, very then important to then criticize, and also, being able to look back and sort of scrutinize the data that has been collected, but that's also sort of based on precedents within colonial.
No, for sure. And I think one of the ways to also decolonize is to go back to other ways of research in non-Western civilizations that have been done but haven't been acknowledged by the West as valid research and valid knowledge production. So I think that is where the alternative comes in, because decolonization is not just about critiquing the colonial origins, but also going back to the knowledge that has been there before colonization. Because there have been very advanced civilizations with very advanced scientific inventions and scientific, contributions. So indeed, to go back to those concepts and see how we can shape science in the present and future would also be part of this decolonial approach, I think.
That's definitely, that aspect about going back is one of my favorite things about the fact that you chose to do a musical documentary, because, oral traditions are often criticized as being, hey, they're inconsistent, blah, blah, blah. But like there's a lot of cultures around the world who have very robust mechanisms for, transporting knowledge and information from generation to generation through these oral traditions. So like that was one of my favorite parts about the soundtrack, is that it just kind of like, it acted as like a conclusion and a transition between chapters. And it just like hit like the points that every person brought up in like their, like during the interviews. And like, yeah, it's definitely great. I like the whole, like the oral tradition narrative is really interesting.
Thank you. But, it is funny that, like I said, the music came first, and then the film. So actually during the process, I had some of these moments like, oh my God, that works so well. Where obviously I had a very intentional approach to directing this movie, but still to see how it all came together was also really fun for me to experience.
We have another question as well. With the benefit of hindsight, I think it's gone now. It was here. With the benefit of hindsight, would you have included anything else? Was there anything that you felt was missed in your documentary that, seeing as you made it a few months ago, do you think now you would have added or taken out anything within it?
No, because this was really, really the story that I wanted to tell the way it is. Obviously there are always things that you can explore, especially when having conversations like this after people have seen the film, and the film has been screened in many different places around the world. So you get all these different international reflections as well. But this is a very specific point of view that I still stand by. And it was also a very intentional approach to invite the conversation, and understanding that this is the reflection of that specific moment in time. I mean, a year later, the world has already changed, but that's okay because we can still learn from, the reflections that I offer from that specific moment in time. So no, when I look at it, I am still proud and also still feel that it's relevant. So and I learn from every Q&A, and I take that with me.
Yeah. We got a question here that says, what do you do to manage and maintain your mental health when engaging in anti-misogynistic and anti-racism work?
Yeah. So I focus on what I'm fighting for. And what I mean by that, this is also something that came up during the interviews that I don't think I ended up using it in a movie, but something that I carry with me also. you know, we tend to focus when you do anti-racism work, you tend to focus on what you're fighting against, right? So you're fighting against racism. But it's really indeed tiresome to fight against something, to knock against doors or a wall. And so it becomes tiresome. And Roberto Hernandez, who was also in the film, he mentioned, you know, it's important to also think about what you're fighting for, because that's what keeps you going. You know, so whenever I think about, you know, the anti-racism work, I think about my community and my people, and, you know, the way that people feel empowered when we talk about these topics from a position of strength. You know, I think about the way that we transform pain to power with art. Art keeps me going. I think about my family. You know, sometimes we have the privilege, or at least I have the privilege to, you know, just take a night off and watch a movie. And then, of course, I'll see colonial mechanisms in the movie. And then, you know, I'll turn it off for a moment. But to also allow myself to, you know, take a moment to re-energize and to focus on things that give me energy, whether it's music or family or meditation. Something that allows me to, you know, to reflect. That helps me with my mental health. And I have to say that stability, at least from my home front, is very important to me. You know, to be able to talk about the experiences and not to keep it to yourself, and to create, you know, your own safe space in that sense really helps me. And I always think about, you know, what I'm fighting for, and that keeps me going.
Definitely
Came through in the documentary as well.
Yeah.
Definitely came through. To take a break, but to also remember, you know, what you're fighting for rather than who you're fighting against.
Yeah.
Definitely, that definitely came through for me. I think we have another question as well, or maybe even a comment. I think this is going back to when we started talking about, you know, data, social sciences and things. So Rachna said, on that point, social sciences has a decolonization to place value on the global south / southern knowledges, yet the global south scholars rarely dare publish without citing global north scholars and philosophers.
Yeah, you know, I think this goes back to decolonizing the mind, because we talk about decolonizing knowledge, which can be considered, you know, a scientific process, right? Because it's about knowledge. But decolonizing the mind is your personal mental liberation, you know. And I recognize that from an artistic point of view, because when I was doing this project, one of the questions, or actually when I was moving towards doing this project, one of the questions that came up for me was, do I take this step and risk losing an audience? Because it's so unapologetic, you know, and it might mean that I lose commercial appeal. As an artist, you know, you're trying to figure out a way to speak to a mass audience. So for me, it was to constantly relate it to a white audience as being the mass audience, you know? And then I realized, okay, you know what? I might lose this audience, and that's okay, because I need to tell this story. I need to tell it with my most authentic voice. And when I made that decision, and also accept the consequences, I'll accept the consequences if I take this step. And by doing so, I felt liberated, because now I didn't have to worry about, you know, the white audience. And actually, I gained a new audience that was much more consistent with my values, you know, and the way that I want to approach life. But it means a mental step to make that decision, to understand what consequences might arise, and to accept those consequences, to accept maybe the sacrifice that comes along with it. And I think that is part of the decolonizing the mind part, you know, that you're willing and able to do it, and you stand by it, and you're unapologetic about it.
Totally.
You know, Rachna did also say she does love the unapologetic nature of the film. So think that came through as well. So yeah, I think, I think also the idea of, as you spoke about in the documentary, of different communities coming together, and it's not just, the Black issue is different from the Indonesian issue, that kind of thing, or and the Zwarte issue is different from the Palestine-Israel issue. I think that is very much, something, again, a marker of decolonizing the mind, knowing that, we all have a common and enemy, shall we say, and that we do need to come, through the sheer number of people, do the powers then realize, oh wait, they're getting wise, kind of thing. So
Yes, indeed, I'm so glad you raised this issue, because this was indeed my one of my biggest aims for this film, was to connect the struggle, because I think that is one of the biggest legacies that we have to overcome, is divide and rule, where we think that our issues are different, and we might want to focus on Black issues alone, or Indonesian issues alone, or Palestinian issues alone, when historically, apartheid in South Africa fell because of the international support, from Palestine, from Cuba, from the so-called enemies of of the West, or they consider, obviously. But and for me, it was to show, but we are connected in in spirit, in struggle, in analysis, because everyone I interviewed, shared that analysis, and then they have different strategies and different campaigns, and that's okay. We don't have to agree on strategies all the time, as long as we agree on the goal and meet each other, at some point to show support. So because that was one of actually the questions that I got when I shared I was making this film. Oh, well, that's a lot to cover, it's a lot to take in, especially in an hour and a half. But I knew that that was one of the most important parts, to show how we are connected.
Yeah, I mean, that does speak to like a lot of because I mean, even within like the Black community, there's a lot of stuff about like diaspora wars. So like, oh, I'm still in Africa, so I'm technically more Black than you, or all those weird things. So the thing about divide and rule is like, no matter how small you make the group, there will always be reasons for people to think that, either you're lesser than, or like you should be the enemy, or so definitely it's important to reach out across, to look above it and see that, hey, we have all been historically oppressed by this one system, so we all benefit from overthrowing it and stuff like that. We also have another question here, and it's basically about like, the nature of the struggle, and it's saying that as we grow stronger and more united in the fight against racism, racists hide their racist agenda behind more appealing and more digestible facades to attract more and more typically white people, by making them feel as if they're the marginalized group, or that they're the ones who have been victimized, which makes them feel more confident in their racist ways. So how do you deal with this sort of like Hydra-like enemy, where even if you like attack one head, 3 sprout in their place? And how do we deal with an enemy like this, even in like 500 years?
Yeah, my approach is really to approach it in an analytical way, because if the analysis is that white people are marginalized and they're the victims, they don't understand what's going on. So you need to explain, that that their analysis is off. So it's not about emotions or feelings. It's about structures, it's about institutionalized mechanisms. That is my approach, to counter with, I like the metaphor of the 3 heads popping up, to address that one head, so that understands that the 3 heads aren't even necessary anymore, because you dismantle the again, the structure behind it, rather than the emotions of feeling marginalized.
Cool. I'm going to have to stop it there because we've only got
Yes.
a minute left. So thank you all. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you Pravini for coming and engaging in this Q&A. I just want to say, remember to tune in tomorrow from 1 to 2 about speculating cities and landscape through QTIA BPOC art practices. So thank you everyone.
Thank you everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you Tyler and Renee also.
Yeah, it was great speaking to you and about the documentary that you've made. It was definitely an important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.
Yeah.